Well, last week, Brian talked about astronomy. And the week before that, Dave talked about design in nature. And of course, the very first week we talked about the importance of the creation issue. And if you remember back, we talked about the importance being in three areas, which we called social, spiritual, and personal. Social importance of creation being it sets the foundation for how we treat one another in our society. How do we determine what's right and wrong? Spiritual was involved in our relationship with God as our creator. That means he is sovereign. That means he is the one who owns us and has a right to our lives. And to, as creator, he tells us what's best. He knows what he's designed into us. And then personal ties into that as we look at our own lives. Understanding creation gives us a meaning and purpose in our own life. As David the psalmist said, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. And the more that we discover who we are in him and what he's put into us individually, the better we can fulfill the purposes for which God created us. And then looking at design and astronomy, both of those really tied back to the idea of God is the creator, the designer. Genesis 1 and 2 talk about creation and design and the various creation days, and then a more specific account in creation 2 on how Adam was formed, and then Eve out of the side of Adam. And so that kind of lays the foundation, but it leaves the question of what happened to God's good earth, because at the end of the creation period, it says that God looked and it was very good. And we look around our world today, and yes, there's beauty here, but there's also sin, and there's also sickness and disease and death and thorns and thistles and all that kind of stuff. And so we're going to move from Genesis 1 and 2 into Genesis 3 to 5, where we find out that sin and death entered the world. Death entered the world through Adam's sin, we're told. And what are the results of that? A very important doctrine in Scripture to understand the fall. And I think sometimes people will just focus on design entirely and look at the design, and design is wonderful, but then the logical question is, well, then what do you do about disease and death and all this other stuff? If God is a good creator, and if God created everything, then how did it all get to be kind of a mess like we see today? And so we need to have a clear understanding of the doctrine of the fall that we find in Genesis chapter 3. And then as we go 3, 4, and 5, we find out that not only did Adam sin, but his son Cain killed Adam's other son, Abel. And we see sin increasing across the world. And we get to the genealogies that are listed, and we find out that death spread to all mankind. Because you read the ages of these patriarchs, and he died, and he died, and he died, and he died. And it's just a reminder back to what happened at the time of the fall. But in Genesis 3, we also see the promise of a Savior to come. And so I believe that in Genesis 1 through 11, we have the foundation of all the rest of the biblical doctrines found in Genesis chapter 1. Now, of course, they're fleshed out, and you can see them expanding throughout the rest of Scripture, but you see doctrinally everything is established in the basis of Genesis 1 through 11. And then God calls Abraham and takes out a people for himself, Abraham and Sarah and the Jewish people and so on. But the foundation found in Genesis 1 through 11. And so that also then becomes the foundation for understanding science. Because when we look at the world, we see this fantastic evidences of design, and the DNA and the molecular motors and the way that the animals fit so well with their environments and all of the wonderful design features that we can find, both in the living world and also in the cosmos, as Brian was showing you, in the universe as a whole, that indicates design that we can see there. This earth was created to be our home, our living place, and God sure did a good job of it. It's a perfect spot. It's got everything we need for life. So today, when we go into was Darwin wrong? So-called proofs of evolution fail. And we're going to look today at biology, and then I believe next time at the fossils. These are the common standard proofs of evolution, the things that you're going to normally hear from people that say evolution is a proven fact. And we're going to go from that to looking more at what do we see then? What do we see if these things are meant to be? Do we have those evidences or don't we? So here we're going to be looking today at the whole issue of evolution and creation. As we've said before, evolution is the idea that grew to you by way of the zoo. In other words, we have everything coming from a common ancestor and changes building up over time. So as we've said in past lectures, many people think creation is just a religious myth, but evolution is science. Now if I'll remind you back, that's what I was taught. And when I got to what I thought was a Christian college, but they taught evolution just as they would anywhere else. They told me Genesis was a myth that was written for primitive people who couldn't understand the science of evolution, and God must have used evolution as his method of creating. And so I ended up thinking creation was a religious explanation for the origin of life, and evolution was the scientific explanation. And, somehow God was involved with that mix, but I couldn't really believe Genesis 1 the way it was written at that point in my education. I went on from there to secular universities. And of course, in secular universities, that's all you ever hear is evolution is science. It's proven scientific fact. Or if they don't call it a fact, they will tell you that it's a theory, but it's the only theory that's ever looked at. And so students come out thinking that it's a fact. But the truth is, both creation and evolution are religious in nature because no one was there. Both of them require faith because evolution requires faith in time and chance and natural processes. Creation requires faith in a supernatural creator. If you tell somebody, an evolutionist, if you tell them you have a lot of faith, they will tell you, no, I don't. I only rely on science. I don't rely on faith. But in reality, they do, because no one was there in the beginning. There were no scientists there to watch it happen. You can't repeat it. You can't do it over again. And so none of that is really true science. I remember one student at a university that we were teaching at, and afterwards he had a question. He put his hand up and he says, I am a skeptic. I was trained to be a skeptic, and I'm really a good skeptic. But then he went on to say, I can't believe the Bible because the Bible teaches that this world is suspended on the back of two turtles. And we're going, oh, really? Where did you learn that? He says, oh, I learned that in the book. Well, that's what Genesis teaches. And the other atheists that were there that night were going, no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. But he was totally convinced. He had faith in what he had heard and not in the realities. Evolution is really then a belief system posing as science, and it is a pillar of the worldview of naturalism, or the idea that everything is just material, that there's nothing beyond that. The interesting thing is your worldview can affect your interpretation of the data. I mean, if you put on these glasses with one red lens and one blue lens, I mean, you're going to get an interesting look at the world. But if your glasses were all red, everything you look at is going to have a pinkish tone to it, isn't it? And if you put on blue glasses, everything's going to look kind of blue. And so if you put on glasses that say evolution all over them, if that's all you're ever taught from the time you're in kindergarten on up, every time you look at the scientific evidence, you're going to see evolution. Unless you take time to clean your glasses or to get a different pair of glasses to look at this world around us. That's why we can have two good scientists, one of whom looks at the evidence and says, wow, isn't evolution wonderful? And somebody else looks at it and goes, what an awesome, powerful creator we have. So this debate is really not a debate over the data, it's over the interpretation of a data. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, if we had a rock, we could take that rock and we could measure it and we could weigh it and we could find the specific gravity and what kind of chemicals made up that rock. And we could learn a whole bunch of things about that rock. But when we start saying this rock was formed millions and millions of years ago under these varying conditions, now all of a sudden we went from data to interpretation. On the data, we as creationists should be able to agree with evolutionists who are scientists if we're honestly dealing with the data. The data should be the same either way. We have the same science one way or the other. It's interpretation that differs. So tonight we're going to look at some of the supposed evidences of evolution, and we're going to see how do these things, are they interpreted by evolution, and then how would I as a creationist look at those things? And at the base level, evolution just means change. I mean, that's what the word means, is change. So we got to ask a few questions. How much change are we talking about, and what kind of change are we talking about? Are we talking about mega evolution, molecules to man? The kind of evolution that tells how we could get this universe coming from nothing, from a speck or something that has supposedly exploded. And from there, we get all of the things in the cosmos and eventually into that very first living cell and all the way on up to man. That we might call the idea of mega evolution, or evolution with a capital E, cosmic evolution. Or are we talking about macroevolution? This only deals with living things. And basically it's looking at how do we get from one type of thing to another type of thing, like from a fish to an amphibian, or an amphibian to a reptile, and so on. Or are we talking about what we might call microevolution? Microevolution is simply variation within a basic type. So for example, within the dog kind, we have all sorts of dogs, or the horses, lots of different types of horses, or lots of different types of frogs. But where did those differences come from? Is this evolution? I say no. What I see here is evidence of variation within the created kind that we would call the dog kind. So we can get great big Dalmatians and little tiny Chihuahuas, and they're still all dogs. We can see that as we look at the various types of dogs. A wolf dog, Canis lupus, is basically the same as domestic dog, Canis lupus familiaris, which is that's a subspecies, actually. That's not even the species. So they're of the same species. And you can see they can interbreed. Now, where are the limits of this dog kind? We don't know for sure, but I feel like that those limits are somewhere around the family level of various types of creatures. And so, we have dogs, we have cats, we have elephants, we have various types, and we might call those the created kinds if we're looking back into the book of Genesis, because in Genesis it says that the creatures were created after their own kind. One kind not coming from another kind. Each individual kind was created specifically, and within that kind, lots and lots of room for variation. So we could call that microevolution, possibly. We could call it adaptation, as over time we see varieties coming either by mankind bringing about specific breeding, or out in nature, these things breeding. what are some of the common evidences of evolution that we run up against when we're talking to people? Of course, one of the most famous is Darwin's famous finches. Darwin went to the Galapagos Islands, and when he was there, he observed these finches, which had different sizes and shapes of beaks and different sizes and shapes of bodies and so on. He supposed that these had come from an ancestral pair of finches that had flown over from South America, and that since that time they had evolved or changed until we get all the variety that we see in the finch types. Classic evidence shown in the books, oftentimes called one of the best proofs of evolution, Darwin's famous finches. But I have to ask the question, what do you start with? You start with some sort of finches and you end up with finches, nothing fundamentally new. And in fact, that's what we see so often when we look at these kinds of evidences, and we need to learn to ask the questions and to really dig into what the arguments really are. As science has progressed, and there's been people doing more and more research on these finches, they found out that those beak sizes and shapes tend to follow periods of wet and dry years, and certain ones are better adapted for eating soft foods and others more adapted for hard seeds and so on. And that can vary back and forth as the seasons change. And so what we're seeing here is not necessarily evolution, but variation within that finch kind. Maybe these changes are due to epigenetics. Now, epigenetics, for those of you that don't know, genetics is based on the structure of the DNA, the linear structure and the shapes and so on of the DNA. But on top of DNA, things in the environment can attach, not in the environment, but things in the environment can cause changes within the DNA that actually kind of stick on top of the DNA and will change which parts of DNA are expressed. Jeffrey Tompkins, who is a researcher down at the Institute for Creation Research, said this: scientists have discovered that the genes are very similar among the various species of these Darwin's finches. They discovered that epigenetics correlated closely with beak size and shape among the species. Epigenetic mechanisms clearly remain a major player in adaptation. We'll look at that just a little more later. This whole idea of epigenetics is a relatively new discovery in genetic research, and it answers a big question that I had for years was, okay, we have the DNA, but that is supposedly not changing unless it's through mutational changes. But now what we're finding out is that there are things within the environment that cause different groups of genes to be turned on and turned off and so on. And epigenetics seems to be a good explanation for that, because there has to be some way in which the individual organisms can adapt for varying environments, and that's pretty much what this will do. Well, peppered moths, here's another classic example. I remember one time when we were privileged to speak in Europe for 5 months and teach the evolution creation issue at many different Bible schools and churches and in missionary bases and so on. And one night when we were in Ireland, we were doing a seminar, and it got over very late in the evening. And afterwards, there was a lady there that we asked a question to her. Anyway, this lady, we tried to make some conversation with her and found out she was a medical student. And she was probably mid-50s. And we asked her, what did you do before becoming a medical student? She says, oh, I used to teach. And she named a bunch of big name universities in Europe and in the United States. So next logical question, what did you teach, right? And she says, oh, I taught evolution and genetics. And I went, oh, good. And so we asked her to tell us, what do you consider to be the best evidence of evolution? She said, oh, by all means, the peppered moths. And I kind of went, oh, that's great, because if that's all she has, there's not much to it. Well, let's look at this idea of the peppered moths. Peppered moths were observed in Great Britain and back in before the Industrial Revolution. And at that point in time, there were light moths and dark moths, but there were more light ones than dark ones. The light ones seemed better camouflaged on the light colored tree, and there was light colored lichen growing on the barks of the trees, and the light ones were better camouflaged, and the idea was that the birds would pick off the dark ones more readily than the white ones, so you'd end up with more white moths. Well, then over time, what happened when they started burning coal and polluting the atmosphere and so on, and they found out that these eventually there were more dark colored moths than light colored moths, and they said, see, this is an example of natural selection. This is how evolution takes place. In other words, here's your proof. Here's evolution. They called it industrial melanism, melanism referring to that dark color. Well, that had stood in textbooks for years as one of the very best evidences of evolution. But we should ask some questions, shouldn't we? We should ask, what do you start with? What do you start with? Light moths and dark moths. What do you end up with? Light moths and dark moths. Nothing fundamentally new. Variations in the numbers, yes, but the characteristics were already there within the population. Now, if this was a real example and if it was really true, we don't have any problem, in understanding that, yes, natural selection works within limited environments. If you have two moths, one dark and one light, yes, it's feasible that one or the other of those colors might be better camouflaged. But it doesn't explain how do we get characteristics in the first place. And then there's something else it does not explain. Evolution does not explain to us how come evolution doesn't really fit in here, because further research has shown that these moths don't even naturally land on the trunks of trees. They don't rest there. They usually rest up in the leaves, up in the foliage. They fly around during the day. They go up in there at night, but they don't land on the trees. In fact, they had to stick them on the trees in order to get the pictures that you see in the textbooks. This may be an entirely bogus example, actually. Jonathan Wells exposed that in his book, Icons of Evolution, back in 2002, but you know what, it's still being taught. And then the Journal of Evolution in September of 2012 confirmed Jonathan Wells's studies and so on. They found the same thing. So really, this example just shows variation within the colors of moths. It fits very, very easily within a creation model. Doesn't have to be an evolutionary evidence. What about antibiotic-resistant bacteria and virus and so on? That certainly is an evidence of evolution, don't you think? Well, mine says my internet connection is unstable, so if I get knocked off of here, we'll get back on. But right now, it's okay. What about these things? Well, you start with bacteria. What do you end up with? Bacteria. Nothing fundamentally new. How do we get anything new? What? It's okay. Okay. So again, we need to ask these questions. What about viruses? Yes, we see that, we're getting all these mutations, they're saying, of the coronavirus and other things. Yes, there can be mutations, but you have to start with something, and it's not changing into anything fundamentally different. It's the same kind of viruses, the same kinds of bacteria. Minor differences within them, but nothing fundamentally new. So I look at these things and I say, yes, variation, yes, but evolution, no. At least not evolution in the sense of molecules to man. Maybe microevolution, possibly. What about the races? What about skin colors? People often ask us, well, if there were only two people to start with, Adam and Eve, then how do you get all the various skin colors you have in the world today? Good question, but I think it has a good answer. It didn't take millions of years of evolution. And by the way, Darwin's book was a book supporting the idea of evolution. In fact, the subtitle of Darwin's book, which was called The Origin of Races, you hear that part of it, but you very seldom see the subtitle anymore, which was called On the Preservation of Favored Races. That's not politically correct these days, and yet Darwin's ideas were very much supporting of racism. Darwin thought that you could start with monkeys and apes, 5 different kinds of apes and monkeys that would become, would evolve separately, and from them we would get different races of human beings. And you'll hear a little more about that later we have a little testimony of Rich. But how can we get the varying skin colors? Well, if you start out with skin colors of mediums, 2 parents with medium skin color, with the right combination of genes, within their children, 1 generation, you could get all the way from lightest light to darkest dark. Doesn't take millions of years. It's simple Mendelian genetics here. Now, I agree this is a simplified example. There are many, many other factors that can enter in and give you variations in skin colors and so on, but this gives you the basis, and it has to do with the amount of a pigment called melanin. We all have it. Some have a lot more melanin than others do, and the amount of melanin in your skin is related to the darkness or lightness of your skin. Well, if you look at this chart, this is called a Punnett square. Punnett squares are very commonly used in genetics to show what happens with genetic mixing from the mother and the father. And if you look way up at the left-hand corner there, the capital letters represent dominant genes. And if you look down in the lower right-hand corner, you see the smaller letters, which represent recessive genes. It so happens that if all 4 of these, 2 from the mom and 2 from the dad, come out with all positive, you have very, very dark skin. And if you have all recessive, like you see in the lower left, you're going to find very, very light skin. And then everywhere in between. Now, if you take 2 children off of here, you could statistically say that if Adam and Eve had 16 children, one of them might be really, really dark, one might be really, really light. And then you might have a whole bunch in variations in the middle. Of course, we know statistics doesn't always operate exactly like that, but that would be the prediction. So if you have this capital A, capital B, if you had 2 parents with that skin color, you'd only get dark skinned children, because they can't do anything else. Every one of their genes would be dominant in this case. Or if the parents both had the recessive, you'd only get light children. So you can see that very quickly we can get a varieties of skin colors. And actually, this has been observed. Here's a family, biological children, and one very, very light and one very, very, well, medium, more medium dark, coming from medium skinned parents. Here's some pictures as they grew and got older. There's an interesting article back in 2017, how Africans evolved a palette of skin tones. I found it very interesting. It said, Tishkoff's team found that the story of skin color evolution isn't so black and white. The study adds to established research undercutting old notions of race. You can't use skin by humans. They said there is so much diversity in Africans that there is no such thing as an African race. And again, we find diversity among human beings, but this kind of diversity, much of it can be explained with Mendelian genetics, plus our newer understandings now of epigenetics and so on. Does not take evolution, does not prove evolution at all. Fits very nicely within the creation model. And then jumping ahead a little bit in Genesis, which we'll talk about in a couple weeks in Genesis 9 through 11, we read about the Tower of Babel. And if after the Tower of Babel, we begin to have different families going in different directions, it's very feasible that those, what we call racial characteristics, could be cemented into a population. And then we would tend to see some populations are darker, some are lighter, some are more in the middle, and so on, as God separated out the people based on language barriers, but nevertheless, as families going out in different directions, we could see how we could cement in these various what we call racial characteristics. But really, there's only one race. It's the human race. And, we all are the same, and we all have the same inside. God has made us the same. Here's a little bit of a testimony from Rich Stepanek about their trip to Africa. And I think you'll find it very interesting.
It is vitally important. Actually, to understand what is happening in the world today, we have to understand Genesis and creation. To understand what's happening in the Middle East, to understand what's happening in this country, in our schools and things that are going on, is you have to understand Genesis, because all of history actually has its roots in Genesis. So if you don't get Genesis right, you can have problems understanding the world events. When I'm teaching at Bible camps and so on, when the campers understand that Genesis affects their life today, they want to know what Genesis says. In every case, they want to know what Genesis says, because they understand that what happened there affects their life today. So they get excited about Genesis and the rest of the scripture. Well, AOI has actually brought this message of creation and Genesis throughout the world. As I'm teaching in other countries, is a lot of the countries, even pastors and even churches have been taught evolution, and so they compromise Genesis with evolutionary philosophies. And in one case, when Lanny and I were in Russia, or not Russia, well, it's actually Russia too, but we were in Africa, and I had African pastors come up to me and ask, what ape did we evolve from? I'm thinking, what? But they were taught that white people evolved from this kind of ape, and the blacks evolved from this different ape, and since our ape was more evolved than their ape, we were more evolved than them. And they were really confused. And so when Lanny and I started teaching that we all go back to one man, one woman, we're all the same color, just different shades, and evolution is false, these pastors got so excited, they actually jumped up and down on their chairs. Can you imagine pastors jumping up and down their chairs, overwhelming, excited about that Genesis is true, that we're all related, we all go back to one man, one woman, that we're all equal. I'm excited about that. We are equipping other people so they can go out and start teaching others about the good news of Genesis, creation, and the gospel message. Because I just got a call the other day from a camp director that I've done some camps with, or taught at some camps. And he said, Rich, you got to come back to camp this year because we are losing students. They believe, they've been taught that evolution is true, and they are telling me, Rich, he said, if evolution is true, that means the Bible's false, and they walk away from Scripture. They walk away from the Lord. So it is vitally important we come to these camps, and come to these churches teaching that the Bible is true, Genesis is true history, and that way these kids don't have to walk away from the faith. They understand that this is true. Be confident that the Word of God is true and changing lives. God gets really big when you study Genesis and creation.
So that was really interesting from Rich, wasn't it? To see how this message could impact those pastors, because you see those pastors have been taught year after year after year that they were less important, that they were less highly evolved than the white people were. They were under the impact of colonialism and other kinds of things that had happened in Africa. But it can be a very freeing message for people when they find out we're all created equal. But the real question now for us as we look at this whole thing is, according to evolution, how do you get new genetic information? Darwin didn't know. He thought that you could inherit acquired traits and then that some traits would be naturally selected out for. Like he followed a form of Lamarckianism. Lamarck believed that idea of acquired traits being passed on. So they thought that like giraffes used to have short necks, and then there were droughts and the giraffes had to stretch their necks to get to the trees, the foliage in the trees, and that stretched neck was then passed on to the next generation. Well, scientists have said, no, Lamarckianism doesn't work. It doesn't explain things, and they've done experiments on that. But interestingly enough, now with this new understanding of epigenetics, I'm not saying that the full-blown Lamarckianism is true, but I wonder how much of what Lamarck was observing could actually be true today as we start to understand more about this idea of epigenetics. What are the proposed mechanisms of Neo-Darwinian evolution? They will say, well, mutation plus natural selection leads to evolution. What is mutation? Just changes in the genetic structure, and natural selection saves some of those and weeds out others. Problem here, neither mutations nor natural selection are creative alone. They can only operate on things that are already in existence. So if you're going to mutate a gene, you got to have a gene to mutate. You can't start from nothing and expect to get the whole genetic complement from nothing. Or if you're going to select something, you can only select what's there. And so mutation and natural selection cannot really explain how they came into existence from the beginning. So the big question then comes is, where do you get life from in the first place? And here's a quote from Franklin M. Harold. He says this: we must conclude that there are presently no detailed Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biochemical or cellular system, only a variety of wishful speculations. While talking about wishful, I wish that they would include statements like this in the schools when they teach evolution, because it's a bunch of speculation. He says we should reject as a matter of principle the substitution of intelligent design for the dialogue of chance and necessity. In other words, just a fundamental principle that they expect you to believe without any evidence. You have to get rid of the idea of design, and you have to embrace chance and necessity, even though he says it's only speculation, that there are no good detailed accounts of the evolution of any biochemical or cellular system. And so it's based on a lot of evolutionary speculation. So the origin of life, according to evolution, which came about, the Big Bang happened, and then eventually we got the Earth, and then eventually we got chemicals on the Earth that eventually formed into the very first living molecules, and they came together to form the first living cell, and so on, all the way up to humans. Nobody's ever observed that. It's purely speculation versus what we would call scientific observation, which is it takes parents to get babies. One generation has to come from a previous generation. And so the creation model fits with scientific observation. Evolutionary speculation goes against scientific observation. We can trace, for example, the origin of human life all the way back to Adam and Eve, not to monkeys, not to apes, but to Adam and Eve, which God created. And he tells us how he did it. From the dust of the ground, he created Adam, and he breathed into him the breath of life. He became a living soul. And that fits with the creation model, and that fits with what we've observed ever since that time. Does somebody have a question? Oh, guess not. All right. Next question, according to actual observations, what do mutations produce? Because we can observe the results of mutations, and we find things like snakes with 2 heads and cattle with extra legs and roosters without any feathers on them. You get all sorts of variations, most of which are harmful, some of which have a good deal have no impact, and then you've got some that marginally might seem to have some sort of a advantage, but usually those aren't really advantageous anyway in the natural world. Fruit flies, another example. These are the most studied little creatures. You know, if you go in a genetics lab, you always got fruit flies that escape and are flying around. You can get all kinds of mutations in fruit flies, some of them with curly wings, some with no wings, some dark-bodied, some light-bodied, various structures, some with 4 wings instead of 2. But the question is, what are they? They're still fruit flies. Nobody's in generation after generation after generation of fruit fly research, they don't turn into anything else. Many of these mutations are lethal. They won't survive at all. And others, you know, are just sort of maybe not as good as the original created fruit flies. So observed results from mutations, we can see duplication of genetic information. For example, 4 wings instead of 2 wings. Well, that's just duplicating the same basic stuff, how to make a wing. You might see loss or breaking of genetic information, like the ones with no wings. You might see deregulation of genetic information. That would be like what you see in cancer cells, or you might see aging and death. Those are actual scientific observable results of mutation. What we don't have is things that seem to get better and better and better. But then the evolutionists will say, well, what about these? Don't they demonstrate evolution? And they name things like flightless beetles or flightless birds or blind cavefish, stickleback fish or citrate metabolizing E. coli. But all of these, every one of these has to do with the loss or the breakdown of information, not additional information that is actually creating something that is new. And a flightless beetle, is that really an advantage? Well, they say, well, it's good if they live on an island and they have a big wind comes through, otherwise they would be blown off the island. But in reality, these things are losing capability that was there. And so you're decreasing the genetic fitness of these creatures. Citrate metabolizing E. coli, these are, they said, were bacteria evolving in the lab, and they called it a poke in the eye for anti-evolutionists. Well, is it really? It doesn't really do that. So in our own, just in the common level of everyday people, we know that mutations are harmful. I mean, if there's an atomic explosion in an electric plant or something, you know, what do they worry about? The radiation. We're worried about radiation because we know radiation is harmful and it can cause mutations. If it was good, we'd want to see evolution progressing at a much faster rate, wouldn't we? So we should do more nuclear testing? I don't think so. Genetic Entropy. This is a book written by Dr. John Sanford, very important book. Dr. John Sanford is a wonderful researcher. He's retired from Cornell University, over 70 scientific articles, 25 patents. He was a co-inventor of the gene gun process, which is the method by which you can sequence the DNA in something. He's no slouch when it comes to understanding genetics. When he began in his career, Dr. John Sanford was an evolutionist, and his research was evolutionary until he got to a point he started going, wow, I don't know if natural selection is powerful enough to weed out all the harmful mutations and to save good mutations. And so he began studying that idea. He said the primary axiom of Darwinian evolution is that evolution proceeds by mutation and natural selection. And that's pretty much what's taught. But then he said, he came to the conclusion that this doesn't work. In his book, you can find it, it says mutational entropy appears to be so strong, especially within large genomes, that natural selection should not be able to reverse it. Careful analysis on many levels consistently reveals that the primary axiom is absolutely wrong. That means what? Mutation plus natural selection do not lead to a progressive upward evolution. He says, if mutation and selection cannot prevent the degeneration of the genome, then the primary axiom is wrong. It's not just implausible. Listen to these words. I love it. It's not just implausible. It's not just unlikely. It is absolutely dead wrong. It's not just a false axiom. It's an unsupported and discredited hypothesis which can be confidently rejected. In other words, if you or your kids are going to a class or watching a movie or something where it says evolution proceeds by mutation plus natural selection, you can confidently reject that belief. You do not have to accept that. So we can say the mechanisms for evolution by which they try to explain the change that we see in living things, mutation and natural selection cannot explain the origin of new kinds of living things. They may have something to do with a little bit of variation once we get living things, but they certainly can't explain the origin of life or the origin of new basic types of living things. Well, what about another area of supposed evidence of evolution? What about this idea of similarity? If indeed we all came from a common ancestor through an evolutionary process, and we came up from these primitive creatures and up through the apes and monkeys and so on, finally became human, we might say, like their cartoon says, are we there yet? Well, evolutionists would say, no, we're not there yet. We're going to continue to evolve and evolve and evolve. And eventually humans will go off the scene and something will evolve to take our place. Not such a hopeful view. A lot of people today are looking at this idea of transhumanism, where they believe now that, well, we can control our physical evolution. So now we can begin to control our future evolutionary development through implants and artificial intelligence and implants in our brains and so on. The basic idea behind that and the goal is to create immortality for human beings, that we can just continue to evolve and evolve as an individual, that we would never die. Well, God promises us eternal life, but not according to implants in our brains and intelligence and so on, artificial intelligence. We are promised eternal life through our faith in Jesus Christ and the work he did on the cross for us. And yet people have this desire to live on for eternity. They want things to go on. They don't want this life to end. And yet God told us when Adam and Eve sinned that death came into the world. Death it's a part of our experience now. But one day it will not be, because Jesus overcame death. And so all this idea of transhumanism, you're going to be hearing more and more about that idea, but it's kind of a big thing coming up. Classically, the idea was more like this. They would look at similar forms like the front leg of a horse and a man's arm and a dog's forelimb and bat wing and so on. They would look at the similarity in the bone structure, and from that they would come to the conclusion that because they're similar, that indicated that they had a common ancestor. This idea is called homology. Homo meaning similar, and ology, the study of. So the study of similarities and similar forms, they say, came from an evolutionary idea. Well, we could look at that, but is there another explanation as to why things might be similar? For us as creationists, why are they similar? Could be because they had a common ancestor. Could be. But are there other reasons? As we understand the biblical account, we understand the various forms, the various kinds of creatures were created distinctly. And so we don't have a common ancestor between human beings and the horse. They were created differently. But we can see that a creator could have designed things for a similar function. So what we might be seeing is a variation on a theme. So a monkey's arm and a human arm are very, very similar. And a dog's leg and a human arm might have some similarities in basic structure because of the variation on that theme. Just like the chair you're sitting in is similar to other kinds of chairs, and yet the various chairs have differences for their particular kind of need. So the seat on the airplane is different than the desk seat and different than your recliner lounge and so on. Maybe things are similar because they were designed by the same designer, one God, not a pantheon of gods. That would be like going into a art museum. And if you have any kind of knowledge of art at all, you can go in and you can pick out the Rembrandts based on use of color, themes, and so on, because they're stamped with that particular artist's creativity. Or maybe things are similar because they were designed to work together. We live in the same ecosystem. We live in a universe. And so the chemicals that are used in our bodies are the same kinds of chemicals that are used in various animals and plants and so on. It's all designed to work together. And so based on that, I mean, you think about a monkey. What does a monkey eat? Basically the same stuff we eat. You would expect there to be some similarities then based on just the needs of those creatures. This is an idea that was used a lot in the past, again, based on this idea of similarity. And they would examine the little human embryo. And this is a picture about 2 months in development, maybe a little less. And it says, look, we had a gill slits and a yolk sac and a tail at that point in development. Well, are they really gills and a yolk and tail? Think about it. Even in the labels that are used, there's an evolutionary bias. Because when you look at the things called gill slits, they're not gills and they're not slits. They're little pouches that are in the little human baby at that point in development. They develop into the systems in the neck and the jaw region of a human being. They don't develop into gills. So they're not gills and they're not even slits. They're little pouches. Why would they call them gill slits? Well, the fish have a similar stage in development where it actually does develop into the gills and so on. But you see that's an exterior similarity, yes, but pretty superficial. The yolk sac, human beings don't need yolk. So we don't have a yolk sac. We have a little sac that forms the first blood cells until the blood can be made in the bones and so on. The thing they call a tail kind of looks like a tail in this diagram, but it's not really a tail. It's just the end of the spinal column, the end of the column in our backbone, and it's got to end somewhere. At this point in the development, it grows a little more quickly than the rest of that little baby. And then later on, it's just enclosed in the body system and becomes the area that we call around the coccyx and so on. So these things, the names of them even are an evolutionary bias, but the whole idea, this similarity does not support evolution. And in fact, we see differences in the embryos that now we know are very, very distinctive. And a good embryologist can look, an experienced embryologist could look at these developing embryos and very quickly within development time, be able to distinguish between the various types of creatures that we see. They didn't always know that. Ernst Haeckel back in the 1800s was a very strong proponent of Darwinian evolution. And he came up with this idea called the Biogenetic Law. And it has a big long mouthful here. So get ready. It's called Ontogeny, Recapitulates, Phylogeny. Now, what in the world does that mean? Well, ontogeny is the individual development as it would develop, say, inside its mother's womb or inside of an egg or so on, recapitulates or goes back over the phylogeny, which is the developmental process of the group as a whole. So in other words, they thought that as a human baby would develop inside of its mother's womb, it would repeat the stages of evolution very, very quickly in those 9-month period, and most of that in the early weeks, actually. But as we know now, that's not the case. We have human DNA from the very beginning. We don't have a little bit of ape DNA with a little human DNA added onto it. We're distinctively human, and the other creatures are distinctively their kind. And so this idea can be just rejected. And it was rejected years and years ago, but it's still maintained in the textbooks for many, many years afterwards. Today, when we talk about biochemical similarities, the one that they use today a lot is called biochemical similarities or biochemical homology. And what they do there is they examine the structure of DNA or RNA or proteins. If they're looking at DNA, they'll look at the letters of the DNA, like the A, T, C, and G. Maybe you remember hearing about those in biology class. Well, that order spells out instructions for the body, how to make various kinds of genes and many, many other things. And so they will look at that order of those letters on the DNA, and from that they try to come up with the tree of life, or how closely related are we to other things. And so they would look at like humans and apes and monkeys and say, well, the DNA there is more closely similar than it is to a pine tree. So that just shows we're more closely related to apes and monkeys than we are to pine trees. And that's how you get things in popular magazines, like this Time magazine article, How We Became Human. It says chimps and humans share almost 99% of their DNA. Is that really true? And if it is true, does that mean we evolved from apes just because we're similar? Well, first of all, even if it was true that we share 99%, that wouldn't mean that we came from apes in the beginning. It might be a kind of a strong circumstantial evidence, but we have a creator. And like we said before, the environment that apes and monkeys live in is not all that different from the environment that humans live in, and the kinds of food they eat and so on. So you might expect some similarity, but that 99% is not accurate. That has gone down with research. Now they're saying maybe it's 93.6% similar. And then if they go down a little further, they're saying it's 86 to 89% similarity is conservative. And Jeffrey Tompkins says it looks like it may be as low as 70 to 71% similar. You don't hear that very often, do you? But as we look into more and more research, that's what they're finding. Part of the reason these original findings were so far off was they were only looking at segments of the DNA that they already thought would be similar between apes and humans. They disregarded all the rest. And so of course you're going to get more similarity in those areas than in the rest. Replacing Darwin is an excellent book by Dr. Nathaniel Jensen. He's got some ideas in there, and he would go into a lot more depth on these kind of ideas. If you have to have some biology background to really understand it. It's a little tough book, but it's for those of you that have a biology background, I think you'd really enjoy reading that. But if people, if apes and humans, they say 90%, 80-some%. What about this? Mice, they say, are 97.5% similar to humans. Zebrafish, 92% similar to humans. Bananas, 50% similar. So maybe we evolved from bananas, right? I don't think so. Way back in 1985, Michael Denton wrote a great book. It was called Evolution, Aetherian Crisis. When he wrote that book, Denton was not a creationist. He's a molecular biologist, not a creationist. But in that book, he recognized something about this whole idea of comparing amino acid sequences to find out similarity now in proteins, not in the DNA, but in the proteins. He said this: the really significant finding that comes to light from comparing protein amino acid sequences is that it is impossible to arrange them in any sort of evolutionary series. So when you try to figure all this out and line them up, it just plain didn't work. Since that time, more research has gone on. Biologist Michael Lynch says this: clarification of the phylogenetic, and that just means the evolutionary relationships of the major animal phyla, has been an elusive problem with analyses based on different genes and even different analyses based on the same genes, yielding a diversity of phylogenetic trees. Did you get that? When they examine the same genes, you can come up with a different phylogenetic tree, a different evolutionary tree. So it doesn't mean a whole lot. There was an article in New Scientist, I believe, 2009, that said, the front cover, Darwin was wrong, cutting down the tree of life. Boy, did they get a lot of flack for this article. People were writing in and saying, oh, cancel my subscription. You're doing junk science. Or they wrote in and said the creationists are going to love you for this one. Well, it was an interesting article. In it, they said this: for a long time, the holy grail was to build a tree of life. A few years ago, it looked as though that grail was within reach. But today, the project lies in tatters, torn to pieces by an onslaught of negative evidence. What was the negative evidence that they're quoting? The negative evidence was the developments and the new information that we're gaining on DNA and genetics. And the more we learned about DNA and genetics, the less it looked like we could easily put that into an evolutionary tree of life. I love this. They said the tree of life, one of the iconic concepts of evolution, has turned out to be a figment of our imagination. And yet, textbooks continue to teach it as if it's real. They said we have no evidence at all that the tree of life is a reality, so it shouldn't be taught as fact in textbooks. It shouldn't even be taught as a really good theory. It's been disproven, really, and yet it's the one that shows up in the books. I love this. At the end, they said, biology is vastly more complex than we thought, and facing up to this complexity will be scary. Well, I don't find it scary. I think the more complexity I find, layer upon layer upon layer, as you study biology, the more that you see the complexity, the more phenomenal it gets and the more exciting it gets. And the more you say, wow, our God is a fantastically creative and imaginative, and what an amazing God we serve. And evolution does not explain the complexity that we see in living things. So the tree of life is being cut down by science itself. So supposed evidences of evolution, change, natural selection, and mutation, we found out that doesn't really lead to evolution. It can be better explained within a creation model of the basic kinds that were created and then the variation that took place from those times. Similarity, again, we don't see the evidence of common ancestry. What about this third one? This is the idea we just call junk. And that means that certain pieces in the body were, they used to call vestigial organs or useless leftovers. And at one point they had a list of 180 different things within the human body that they said were leftovers from evolutionary development. All these things you see on the screen there: pituitary gland, thymus, tonsils, appendix, wisdom teeth, and a bunch more. Well, as a creationist, if we found something new in the human body, would we assume it was a useless leftover from evolution? Or would we say, no, God doesn't make junk, go back to the lab, let's do the research, let's find out what it does. It's not just a useless evolutionary leftover. And sure enough, as the years went by and they did the research, they found out the pituitary gland, master gland of the body, very much involved in the regulation of the body's processes and so on, the hormones and other things. Very, very important for humans and very needed for life. The thymus, the tonsils, and even the appendix now have been found to be important in immunity. And many of you, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when they used to take kids' tonsils out, they'd get infected 2 or 3 times, and they'll say, let's take them out. They don't really do anything anyway. And the appendix the same way. Well, now they found out, don't do that. Don't take it out unless it's really infected, because the tonsils are important in the immunity in the neck and the throat region, and the appendix is important in fighting in fighting harmful bacteria and so on in the lower gut region. In fact, the appendix seems to be a harbor for good bacteria. So if you get a bad case of diarrhea or you got to go in for a medical test, and you clean out your whole system, the appendix has good bacteria in it, can reboot your system up and get it going again. Wisdom teeth, very obviously just teeth. They're used for chewing. Now, sometimes people's mouth structure doesn't develop well enough or big enough, and you find out that the teeth become impacted and they need to be removed. But that didn't mean it was a vestige from leftover from evolution. Many people still have wisdom teeth. They're just teeth. They're for chewing, just like the rest of the teeth. How do you deal with these kinds of things? Well, as a creationist, or evolutionists will oftentimes say, well, it's a useless leftover because you can live without it. Well, that doesn't mean anything. You can live without your hand. That doesn't mean your hand is a useless leftover. Or they say something can go wrong with it. That must prove evolution instead of creation, but something can go wrong with your heart too, and that doesn't mean it's a useless leftover. So all these things that they called vestigial organs, I don't believe they're useless leftovers at all. Now, it is possible that over time something could lose function, isn't it? Because we know that things that keep going downhill in this world that we live in, this world that is still impacted by the fall, this fallen world. Someday all that will be reversed when Jesus comes back and we get the new heavens and the new earth. But until then, we live here in this world during this time, and things are running downhill. So it is possible that something could lose function. It's a whole lot more difficult to imagine things gaining function, like a pituitary gland or thymus or any of these things coming about through random chance processes of evolution. What about junk DNA? I mean, this is the one they used a lot up until just a few years ago. Junk DNA, when they first came out with these ideas about they said like 97 or 98% of the DNA molecule is junk. It's useless. It was left over from evolution, and it contains the history of our evolutionary development, but it has no function today. And at that point, when we first heard those statements, coming out, we made a prediction based on a creation model, which said, wait a minute, God doesn't make junk. It has a function. Go back to the lab, do the research. We predicted at that point in time that these things, there would be function found for those portions of the DNA. And sure enough, that's exactly what's been found. As the research has progressed, John Sanford said, it's becoming increasingly clear that most or all of the genome is functional. A while back, there was a project called the Encode Project. This was a multinational project with scientists from all over the world, each working on various pieces of what was called junk DNA. And the whole purpose of this research project was to find out, do these segments of DNA have any function or don't they? At the end of their time, they said this: almost every nucleotide is associated with a function. In other words, it's not junk. It has a purpose, just like we would expect within the creation model. And then they said this metaphor of junk isn't that useful. And this is the key point. It's not junk. It's not junk at all. Some of the things, there's a long list of what now they have found that this, what they call non-protein coding DNA does. And so what they were originally looking at was, does it code for protein or not? And all this stuff that didn't code for protein, they were calling useless. Now they know it's useful in repairing DNA, assisting in DNA replication, regulating DNA transcription, aided in folding of the chromosomes, aids in the maintenance of chromosomes, controlling RNA, editing and splicing, helping to fight disease, and regulating embryological development, and lots more. So even I mean, we wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for those segments that they had called junk DNA. They're very, 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 very important, and lots of articles you can pull up that talk about these things that used to be called junk DNA. There's new evidence of functionality. This was just back in July last year of the so-called junk DNA. They talked about the potential role of junk DNA in aging and cancer research. So very interesting potential to look at there. Human Genome 20th Anniversary, Junk DNA Hits the Trash, article by Jeffrey Tompkins again. So it isn't junk, it looks designed. So we can look at all these various things, supposed evidences of evolution, change or similarity or junk, and we can just say, no, these things are not evidences of evolution. They're interpretations, but we believe that the scientific evidence much more clearly and much more directly fits with a biblical account of creation, design, the basic animals and plants, and human beings being designed by God in the beginning with a potential for variation, and that as death came into the world, when sin came in, death came in, and we've seen things going downhill since that time, mutations and selection, then natural selection weeds out those that are not fit to survive in particular environments. We look at natural selection as a conservative mechanism, not a creative mechanism. So was Darwin wrong about biology? Well, yes and no. He was wrong about a lot of things, but he was right about some things too. He recognized complexity in various ways. But if you put yourself back to 1850s and think about it, what if Darwin had been alive today? I wonder, would he have a different understanding? I mean, Darwin knew nothing about human cells. He thought the cell was just a bag of protoplasm. He had no idea of the complexity of a cell and all of the little organelles within the cell and the complexity and the organization within the cells. He had no idea of that. He had no idea about Mendelian genetics. In fact, Mendel's work was published just shortly after Darwin's work. And Mendel's experiments demonstrated and explained a lot of what Darwin was trying to explain through evolution, but he didn't have that understanding of genetics that we've had now for, well, in the case of Mendelian genetics, over 150 years. Darwin had no idea of DNA and proteins, and the connection between DNA and proteins. He didn't know that it takes proteins to make DNA and DNA to make proteins. You know, it had to start someplace. We believe it started with design, with God creating the DNA and this fantastic process by which the DNA is used to line up the amino acids eventually to make these proteins, which are the building blocks of life, really. So my question is, what if he had known about those things? Would he have been a believer at this point? Would he have opted for a creation model instead of an evolutionary model? We have no way of knowing that, do we? But the case is today, we know so much more than we knew back then scientifically. And I think there's really no excuse for evolution being taught as scientific explanation today, at least not the overall theories of evolution. You know, the variation within a kind, that's a little more likely to be in there, but it doesn't explain how we get new varieties of living things. So when it comes to the evidence and all these supposed evidences of evolution, we can just say no to them. Next week, we will be looking, Dave will be doing a talk on Was Darwin Wrong? Part 2 here on the fossil record, because really the fossils are the only cold, hard evidence we have of evolution, right? And so stay tuned for that next week. We hope you'll come back on next week and get that part on fossils. And in the meantime, visit our website, Those of you that haven't made it there yet, there are hundreds and hundreds of articles on there. We have a very strong search engine on there. You can search both our site, and if you don't find what you're looking for on our site directly, there's an advanced search that will take you to 6 other short age creation sites with multiple more articles. So I think it's a powerful place for you to go for more information. We'd also like to remind you, we have the Yellowstone Tours coming up at the end of the summer. 2 different tours. You can sign up for one or the other of those. And we're doing a short Arches Canyonlands creation tour we have scheduled right now, and we're in the details stage with that. We haven't really started advertising it yet outside of this group, but that will be on April 9 and 10 to go down at Arches and Canyonlands from a creationist point of view, from a young age geology point of view, of a flood geology point of view. So we would encourage you on that. And I don't have the dates up here for the training week, but we're also, for those of you that are involved in that and want to come to the training week, that would be April 4 through 8. And at that training week, we're going to dig a little deeper into some of the science. But what we really want to do with that week is to equip you with tools and knowledge in ways in which you can take your understanding that you're learning about creation, and you can begin to use that to teach other people. And so we highly encourage you to come to that. There will be some segment of those in there for those of you that are interested in children's ministry. Lanny and Marilyn Johnson are going to be joining us and doing a workshop on children's ministry during that time. And you will also have an opportunity during that time to, within that small group, where it's not so intimidating, to be able to bring a short teaching yourself and be critiqued on it, never with a purpose of cutting things down, always with the purpose of helping you to grow in your ability to communicate these things to others. And Brian will be doing a segment of that training week on using surveys to reach out to people, whether it's on the college campus or elsewhere. And you've been seeing some of those survey questions that Brian's encouraging you. Those surveys are an excellent way, really, to strike up a conversation with people and to find out where they're at. So we encourage you to discover creation. Don't ever worship the creation, though, worship the creator. And we're going to take some questions if you have them now. I will stop sharing screen. At least I think I will.
I think we have a Class A miracle here tonight. Mary Jo finished right on time by 7:30. In fact, it's only just turned 7:30.
He did it.
How about that?
Yay, Mary Jo.
Hey.
That's a miracle, yes.